This evening on the Rock Newman Show, the practice of enslaving and forcing Africans to perform hard labor was a linchpin of the American economic system. An even more insidious part of that practice was slave breeding. Tonight we share an illuminating discussion with Ned and Constance Sublette, whose book, The American Slave Coast, gives us insight into that practice. That's coming up on the Rock Newman Show. Welcome to the Rock Newman Show from the campus of historic Howard University, located right here in the nation's capital. I'm Rock Newman, and it is my desire to inspire you with personal stories of extraordinary achievement. In their book, The American Slave Coast, Ned and Constance Sublette show us how the children and children's children of the enslaved became a virtual money-making machine for slave owners, where human beings became the basis for money and credit. That all changed when the United States ended the importation of Africans from the continent, but the practice of slavery, so deeply embedded in the economy of slave states, continued with the horror of slave breeding. Tonight, we take a painful look at this dehumanizing practice with my guests, historians Ned and Constance Sublette. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having us. It's an honor to be here.
It surely is.
I want to say to my viewing audience here tonight that in order to find light, this subject matter and this book takes us through a very dark, painful tunnel. It is my hope that doing a program like this might help illuminate the issues, have people to understand some of the history of slavery, which directly connects to how all of us live in this country today and how we see each other. Thank you for doing this book, The American Slave Coast, Ned and Constance Sublette. There are so many places we could start, but I want to start here. Thomas Jefferson, who is approximately 8 miles sort of southwest of the studio, and the edifice sits down there on the bank of the Potomac River, was a slaveholder. And he bred slaves. And the slaves that he bred, when they were sold, they would march from Charlottesville on foot with shackles around their necks, sometimes to New Orleans, to Mississippi, and other points south. I want to start there. When you were doing the research for this book and you came upon that kind of a reality, what was your reaction?
My first reaction to that sort of thing, when I would be reading about it, reading the descriptions, the first thing I always thought of was the women, because I knew that no doubt there were women who were marching in these coffles, who were pregnant, who were nursing a child, had another child with them, maybe all three. So the march itself is extraordinarily difficult. They're not being fed very well. They're being mistreated. And they're having to deal with terrified small child, a nursing child, and maybe a child on the way, and maybe other things as well. That's the first thing I thought of.
Let me stay with you. You said a terrifying journey.
Yes.
That's a terrifying journey. Describe it.
First of all, you're being taken away from your family. You do have a family, particularly in the time of Jefferson in Virginia. Most people, even if they had been sold away from the home that they had been brought up in, they were sold to another plantation where they would have relatives. So there is a whole family community. So you're being taken away from that, and that's everything you know. That includes your culture, your religion, the music that you like to sing and play when you have a chance to do it, maybe even the church that you are in. All of that is being taken away from you. You are being taken away from that, and you're going somewhere else that you know nothing about, and you are being thrown in with a huge number of people you don't know.
Ned?
Every farm with slaves was a slave breeding farm. Let's just start there. Because every child born to a slave owner enhanced the slave owner's wealth. And a slave owner was absolutely free to sell any of the enslaved people that he legally owned anytime he wanted. So there was, whether it was Jefferson or any other slave owner, there was always a pressure on, this is where we come up with the term the capitalized womb. There was always a pressure to coerce enslaved women to reproduce as early as they could and as late as they could, as often as they could. The pressure was unsubtle.
You guys, this book is north of 700 pages.
Yeah.
You did extensive research. You've been lauded by historians and academicians for, the incredible research that you did. When you said that women would be coerced and forced, and absolutely forced into submission for whatever the slave owner wanted. In that exhaustive research that you all do, what were the early ages that you found that the slave owners started to have the girl child starting to procreate?
As early as their bodies could do it.
Yeah, just as soon. And there is evidence that slave owners paid fair amount of attention to see when a girl child would be able to start bearing children. And in certain documents that we have read, it got so coercive that if she herself was not interested in partnering up with another African American on the plantation or the farm or the cotton field, wherever it might be, they would just point and say, this one, you go with him. It wasn't like you were actually being married. Mm-hmm. It was like, but the point is to get her pregnant as soon as possible, mm-hmm. because, as we say, the capitalized womb, the moment that child came into the world, the credit that the owner of that child had increased automatically at least $50. Mm-hmm. And $50 was not a small amount of money for your average American at that time.
Mm-hmm. And so I'll stay still here with Charlottesville and Jefferson, who many revere as a damn near a deity. So Jefferson sort of obviously became president, a highly respected figure, but Jefferson is someone that was quite okay with the laws being established that said the slave owner, if in the midst of him correcting the slave, should he kill him, which would have been murder, should he kill him, there was no legal consequence.
That was the law, generally speaking. I mean, from the foundations of from the foundation, certainly, well, South Carolina, very much so. Yeah, Jefferson, I mean, more than any other single figure, Jefferson was responsible for the creation of the slave breeding industry in the United States for actions he took as president.
Ned,
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop you there and have you to repeat that, because we have viewers who are looking in here,
Yeah.
who absolutely go down and pay honor and homage to that, again, edifice down on the banks of the Potomac River, and who revere him as a deity. So please repeat that.
That more than any other single person, Thomas Jefferson was responsible for the creation of the slave breeding industry in the United States.
And can you share with us how he went about doing that?
Very simply, I don't know how many people know this. There's a lot of real basic stuff that people don't know. A lot of people don't know that the slave trade from Africa was prohibited by federal law as of January 1st, 1808.
Yes.
What a lot of people don't know is that that date's in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, not as the date at which the slave trade must stop, but as the date before which it cannot be prohibited. It's the only date in the Constitution, which otherwise is much more abstract. It was put in there at the insistence of the South Carolina delegates to the Constitutional Convention, who wanted a 20-year guarantee that the African slave trade could continue. There was a confrontation of power at the Constitutional Convention between slave breeding Virginia and slave importing South Carolina. Virginia held the political cards and it won. South Carolina's response was to become kind of a renegade state, which ultimately led the path to secession and civil war. Jefferson's role in this, well, in particular, Jefferson very proactively, as president in 1806, asked Congress to prohibit the slave trade at the earliest possible constitutional date. He already in 1806, he's asking to have this January 1st, 1808 cut off so that not one more African would be brought than after that date.
Yeah.
And Jefferson really tried to spin it as a humane gesture, but
And got credit.
ending slavery would have been humane,
Right.
but slavery didn't end. What that was protectionism.
Yeah.
Jefferson was responding to not only his own financial predicament, but to that of his constituents in Virginia. He was making it impossible to bring in the cheaper foreign imports, so that if you want to speak of it in industrial terms, the human product raised in Virginia and Maryland became much, much more valuable, making his colleagues in Virginia much wealthier.
I would just like to add something to this, which is, I think, very important. Throughout the whole history of slavery in the United States, and I'm speaking of the United States as opposed to the colonies before independence.
Right.
Throughout that whole history, the people who were born and bred in Virginia and Maryland gained the most premium prices on the market for all kinds of reasons. And Jefferson was already aware of the fact that their population of enslaved labor had all of those traits and characteristics that other buyers in other parts of the region that were opening up for agriculture in various forms would be looking for. And throughout the whole history, up through the Civil War and abolition, Maryland and Virginia were the center of that. These were the most valuable property that you could buy and sell.
Now, can you give us an example as to why that was? You said the certain traits. Why was that? Why were the slaves from Maryland and Virginia deemed to be more valuable?
They spoke English. That was part of the protectionism that Jefferson was very aware of, because imported slaves, imported people, imported people did not speak English yet, although they were already learning many other languages as they had been captured and thrown together with other captives. And the first thing that you have to learn when you are taken somewhere is that language. So here we have generations of people in Maryland and Virginia who have grown up speaking English. They know the routines of the various kinds of farm work that they're supposed to be done, that is supposed to be done. They have a lot of training in everything that you could possibly want. And for generations now, of whether it be domestic work, work as a lady's maid, work in the kitchen, work in the field, working with horses. And I remember, I shouldn't say it that way, but Virginia and Maryland early on loved horse racing. Imported, blooded stock, all the rest of it. And who took care of those horses? Who trained those horses? Who rode those horses? There's just the enormous amount of skill and talent that was available already right here that nobody had to train them to do. It was here.
And they were born into slavery.
Oh, and I forgot the religious side of it.
They had not been born free.
Yeah.
They had born into perpetual slavery for them and their descendants until the nth generation. This was a particularly cruel feature of Anglo-American slavery that was not the case in the Spanish domains, for example.
So we talking about Jefferson and Monticello. That's in Charlottesville. That's further south. But coming very close to Washington, D.C., maybe 14, 15 miles away, is Mount Vernon, George Washington. Talk a little bit about Washington's role in history in slavery.
I think, particularly in terms of history, when it came to the father of our country, he was very aware from a quite early age of wanting to be in history. He wanted to be remembered. And though the fact that he married an heiress who owned a large number of slaves, which then gave him the platform to start showing up on the whole stage of the state and the region, and then later the national stage, he was much more educated and interested in what people said in other countries than he's often given credit for. And abolition was not just a new idea. I mean, even in the days of Rome, there were people saying slavery is not a good thing. So he knew in Europe there were people who were anti-slavery, and particularly after independence. It was so, people were so aware that here is a nation that prides itself on being the most free nation in the world, and they hold slaves. And they have slaves right there in the Capitol.
And you know, I'd like to take a moment there to do something, because the knee-jerk reaction of too many today who don't want to deal with the history of slavery or the vestiges of slavery would say, that was back then and that's what they did then, to very disingenuously ignore that very clearly there were people who had a moral compass that said unmistakably, not only is this wrong, it is terrorizing, it is horror, it is dehumanizing also. And those individuals that we're talking about, the quote unquote beloved founders and framers of the Constitution, ignored the morality of the issue and absolutely went full steam ahead as barbarians continuing to contribute to and develop and to grow slavery. I want to really draw a line in the sand there for those who might be watching, who might have the tendency to look back and say, why are you talking about it in 2019?
Well, and Jefferson in particular, to go back to Jefferson for a minute, Jefferson in particular was very aware that all over Europe there were anti-slavery people because they were his friends in the French Revolution. Jefferson was very well aware of this. So Jefferson can't simply be excused as being a man of his time, because other men of his time were anti-slavery, other men of his time fought against slavery, and other men of his time freed their enslaved people, as George Washington did on his death. But to do that meant that one was voluntarily impoverishing oneself. And not many people were willing to take that step. George Washington could free his slaves on his death because he had no son. He had no heir. If he had had a son, to devalue his estate like that would have been seen by the son as a betrayal, right? Because, and here's like the bullet point, people were the money in enslaved territory.
And
people
were the money.
And there's one other thing, if you can remember who it was in South Carolina who said this, who was talking about slavery was not good. It was hard on the masters. It was hard on everyone, except it was so convenient.
Yes, I'm
blanking on his name also, but in the end, this is why we cannot get rid of slavery, because it is so convenient for us. And when we say convenient, think of all of the ground that word must be covering. What is convenient? It is convenient for us because they are giving us income. They are giving us every kind of service that we can even dream of. Yeah, it is convenient.
the general inconvenience.
When you say every kind of convenience we can think of, I was telling you all beforehand that this book,
Patrick Henry.
this book really took me someplace in a very visceral way. My mother was 4'9", and she was, by all accounts, she was 46 years old when I was born, but by all accounts, she was a little cutie at 4'9". And I read something in your book here. Before I talk about that, this is a photo of my wife and my daughter. This photo was taken in the very early 70s, and I saw a term used in your book, and it was fancy girls.
Yeah.
When I say I had a visceral response, it was because of that little 4'9" lady that you just saw.
Yeah.
And it was because of this photo right here, because all three of them would have been fancy girls. Now, before you respond, my first love, you know how to say there's no love like a first love. My first love was a very, very, very dark, black chocolate, just beautiful woman. So when I imagined the plight of the fancy girls, which I want you all to talk about, and then I imagined the plight of this very dark, black, beautiful woman and what she must have experienced, that was the source of my visceral response. Ned?
Fancy girls were, it was a polite term, universally understood for sex slaves. Fancy girls were light-skinned women who brought very high prices in auction. Young, beautiful, generally light-skinned women who were sold as fancy girls. This was always a part of the slave trade.
Yeah, and I know you talk, I've heard you talk about fancy girls being in, for example, in New Orleans, and the riverboat gambler
Right.
buying, winning,
New
winning
Orleans
at the
was
crap table or
particularly
whatever.
known
And
for
then
this.
and then the riverboat gambler would buy a couple of the fancy girls, and then that riverboat gambler added another title to his name, which ultimately was degenerate pimp. And then he would rent them out. He would rent them out.
Or perhaps
And they had, I want to keep this front and center sitting at this table, they had no right or recourse.
none. No, and maybe not rent them out by the hour. Maybe negotiate longer-term contracts
Sure.
for them. Although the working life of a fancy girl was fairly short, because there was always a newer, younger one available. There's an absolutely heart-rending letter that we reproduce in full in the book by a woman who's somehow managed to write a letter from a slave trader's yard in Houston, where she's been discarded and is being sold. Understand that being sold out of one market into another almost always meant going into a worse environment. It was like being sent to prison or being sent to a worse prison.
Yeah.
And to be sold into Texas in the 1850s was a horrifying prospect. And there's this just absolutely heartrending letter in the book from a woman named Virginia,
Yes.
who's telling the story of what it feels like. It's one of something else we have to remember. Not only they have no recourse, very few had literacy skills.
Yeah.
It was prohibited to teach enslaved people to read and write, and so they left no record of their thoughts in any written form. They may survive in other ways through oral tradition or family tradition, but there's the 100 or so-called slave narratives that were published, and the couple 3,000 oral histories that were taken have to stand in for millions.
Yes. Ned, what I'd like for you to do, because it's in the book, is for you to go back to that letter from that lady there in Texas and pull a snippet or a highlight or a low light. I don't know necessarily that you got to find it. I'm just talking about like what you remember and how that touched you.
Well, we actually have a stage version of this book that we have done a couple of times with multiple readers and music. And sort of the centerpiece is reading this letter in full, which of course we're not going to do now.
Yeah.
But here's I don't know if you can see, this I don't know if you can see this, but with the maybe you could just read. I think it'd be more
This
appropriate in a
paragraph?
woman's voice. Why don't you just read that paragraph?
You wrote for them to sell me in 30 days. Do you think that after all that has transpired between me and the old man, I don't call names, that it is treating me well to send me off among strangers in my situation to be sold without even my having an opportunity of choosing for myself? It's hard indeed, and what is still harder, for the father of my children to sell his own offspring, yes, his own flesh and blood. My God, is it possible that any freeborn American would brand his charities with such a stigma as that? But I hope before this he will relent and see his error, for I still believe that he is possessed of more honor than that. And that tells you so much information right there. The father of the child and other children is the man who is selling her. And how in the world did she get those skills to write and then smuggle this letter out? What is the we
And
know,
you know what
so
I got from
little
that
about
also?
her is
What I got from that also is just the unbelievable sense that she still had some hope in humanity. In spite of what this beast was doing, she still had hope that he might rise above his inhumanity. That spirit of hope which obviously kept folks alive.
Yes, that's right.
And also, again, I am even more struck for some reason by her ability to get the materials in a slave auction house or prison, get the materials to write the letter, get the letter out, and the letter was received because this letter is in the archive of the man who had sold her.
The fact that it's preserved in the slave trader's archive is the only way we have of knowing that Virginia Boyd ever existed.
But what she had, oh, wow.
Please tell me this. What in the world was your motivation for writing this book?
This story has to be told. A whole lot in American history makes no sense if you don't understand this, and a whole lot makes sense if you do. The basic, even the human side of it aside, just as an understanding of how the American economy was based on and distorted by the domestic slave trade, which is to say the slave breeding industry. It's simply, a lot of American history is simply incomprehensible if you don't understand that in the slave states, people were money. Why were the slave states so insistent on annexing Texas and the non-slave states not wanting to annex Texas? Because very simply, the mere rumor of cotton plantations springing up in eastern Texas that would need to buy labor from the slave owners that already existed in the South jacked up the value of their portfolios, made them richer people. It's hard to remember that how wealthy slave owners were. If you don't know this, you can't imagine Mississippi. Why we think of Mississippi as the poorest state in the Union, but in its day, it was the richest. It had the most millionaires. Mississippi was, the slave owners were not just wealthy, they were tremendously wealthy, but their wealth was in the form of people who were human savings accounts, because there was no reliable national money. And we did not get a reliable national money until the Abraham Lincoln's administration and the Greenback, which is pretty much concurrent with the Emancipation Proclamation, and which would not have been possible with the vastly inflated human assets on the books. I don't know if that makes sense. It's a complicated subject. But the fact that every new child that was born was, depending on the era, $50, $75, $100 in credit, which is to say money. New money was a human being born was the creation of money. Of more wealth. And the amount of wealth that the South held in enslaved property, which was estimated at the time, commonly estimated at the time of secession to be $4 billion. That was a sum that was so in excess of, it was a multiple of all the currency in circulation. It was a multiple of the worth of the land. It was a vast amount of money that only existed on paper and only resided in the bodies of labor. Labor was capital. And if you don't know this, you don't understand the levers that moved American history.
What kind of reaction and what was the response of those who, you know, as people who are in power in top places in government right now? They would say this is fake news. And so I'm just wondering, when this book came out, give me an example of some of your harshest critics.
Well, when this book came out, Barack Obama was president. And we had not entered the next level of madness that subsequently appeared. we got a lot of support. Of course, I mean, our hardest core of support is African American readership. Yeah, and we got the American Book Award. We had a live theatrical version in New York. The theater was full. Nobody really came and said we didn't do our research right. And people who aren't interested in this, the people who would think that aren't going to bother to read this book. People who read this book are the people who want to know.
Yeah. So you mentioned in this book, you mentioned a couple of places that are just like nearby. Alexandria, the port of Alexandria, that's 5 miles away from where we sit in this studio. Baltimore is maybe 25 miles away. Talk to us, please, about their influence, their impact on all of this.
Let's start with Alexandria.
Alexandria, Virginia, of course, we're talking about.
Alexandria, Virginia, but also Alexandria District of Columbia. Because District of Columbia created 10 miles square, not 10 square miles. It's 100 square miles. It's 10 miles square, right? 10 on each. All right. So the District of Columbia was created out of land north and south of the Potomac. 60, I think it was 61 square miles from Maryland and 39 from Virginia. There were 3 cities in the District of Columbia: Alexandria, Georgetown, and Washington City. The public buildings were all by law on the Maryland side. And Alexandria was designated the port of entry. And it became one of the first most important capital of the slave breeding, of the domestic waterborne slave trade. More slave ships came to New Orleans, the greatest slave market, from the east coast of the U.S. than from Africa. Alexandria is where the largest slave trader in American history, Isaac Franklin, 1315 Duke Street. It's now the Freedom House Museum of the Urban League of Northern Virginia. That was Franklin and Armfield's headquarters. They were a nationally integrated slave trading company that began running packet boats, boats that ran every 2 weeks, whether they're not waiting to get a cargo, but on a schedule. They shipped enslaved people on a schedule every 2 weeks down south. Alexandria was where this got started. And Alexandria was the slave trading center. Slaves were sold in all 3 cities of the District of Columbia. And it was a source of great shame to many decent people in the United States that their nation's capital was a site of slave sales and of slave prisons. Foreign diplomats were astounded to see this going on in the capital of this nation that made such a big deal about freedom and liberty. And ultimately, Alexandria rejoined Virginia because of this pressure. Alexandria rejoined Virginia in order to be able to keep selling slaves when it looked like federal law might prohibit slave sales in the District of Columbia, which it did as of after the Compromise of 1850. So Alexandria rejoined Virginia, and the present District of Columbia is the former Maryland land. So that's a little about Alexandria.
But also, many of the people that were harvested, again, they came from the premium breeding area, which was Maryland and Virginia. So they had like really good product to sell.
Let me stop you for a second, because you use a term, you said harvested. And I know that you've been dealing with this subject matter for so long and with such depth. But just to hear that word roll off of your lips, harvested.
It's painful. Words like harvest, product, breeding. That's what it was in the industry.
I grew up on a working farm. I know how farming works. And this is what this was.
Explain that, because you go into, in the book, you go into detail.
Yes. The point of agriculture is to plant and get a harvest.
Yeah.
And this applies not only to grain, fruit, vegetables, it applies to your animals, your ducks, your geese, your cows, your horses. And a good, well-managed farm gets rid of what doesn't work anymore. Very quickly. You raise for the very best you can to sell on the market. You might keep for yourself things that are not as valuable, but generally there's just no room for that. So when your chickens are too old to lay eggs anymore, you eat them or sell them. And that's very much this mindset of all of these people here, because this is part of good agriculture management. So we raise as many good children as we can to sell them on the market later when we need them. Maybe we will keep them for a while.
Careful with the we.
Yes, well, exactly. But this, I am inhabiting the mind.
The mindset.
I understand.
Wanted to
understand.
just
and
want
while
to
you're
underscore
inhabiting that mindset, while you're inhabiting the mindset of the slave owner,
Yes.
this very slave owner held up the Bible.
Yes.
Talk to us about that.
Well, there was a northern church and a southern church. The southern church, and this, as we got closer and closer to the point of secession and things just got crazier and crazier, the southern church got more and more pro-slavery. Famously, Woodrow Wilson, the racist President Woodrow Wilson's father, was a minister who published a famous sermon on mutual relations between masters and slaves as set out in the Bible. I want to go back to Alexandria and this concept of harvesting, because there was a whole network that fanned out, and this also takes us back to Baltimore, because Baltimore is where those infamous Cash for Negroes advertisements began appearing after the War of 1812, when this thing really kicks into high gear, and every little town had newspapers in those days, and a key element of its advertising was always either ads for runaways, for recapture of runaways, or for sale of people. And every little newspaper had Cash for Negroes advertisements posted by traders who then had a network of agents who fanned out and went around to every little town and chatted up people at the local tavern, found out who might have a surplus 17-year-old farmhand that they might want to sell. I mean, and many of these people were former horse traders, and ultimately, after the end of slavery, went back to horse trading, because horse trading is done very much in this way too. Would go around and one by one purchase adolescents from all these regional farms. At some point, a cargo would be assembled, and they would either be driven down in a coffle or sent out by water from Alexandria, Richmond, Norfolk, or Baltimore. Baltimore sent out lots and lots of people. Baltimore was, of course, in the 1840 census, Baltimore and New Orleans were virtually tied for second largest city in the country. And they did a tremendous amount of business by water with each other of all sorts, but most definitely in slaves.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the slave rebellions. Well, first of all, let's talk about the impact that the rebellion in Haiti had on slave owners here in the United States.
Struck terror into their hearts. It made everything much much more paranoid and much more locked down. This was their ultimate nightmare come true, very simply. And rebellions everywhere there was slavery. In every era there was slave rebellion. Wherever there was slavery, there was slave rebellion. Whether it took the form of large organized uprisings or day-to-day resistance, there was always rebellion, there was always resistance, there was always pushback. When it reached a certain level, it wasn't called a slave rebellion anymore, but a war, and there were some big wars. Most notably, what we call the Civil War, which was a war for, once it was reclassified as a war for emancipation, with the Emancipation Proclamation. I don't know if people realize this, but the Emancipation Proclamation didn't just declare enslaved people to be free, it also provided for the enlistment into the Union Army and arming of them, which had not been previously allowed. And at that point, once black soldiers could come into the army, that was a slave rebellion in a sense. That was the moment at which, and that was the moment at which the war could be won. But there are others. Of course, the Haitian Revolution is the famous example.
Sure.
And there was also when Andrew Jackson went into Florida to suppress a coalition of black and Native American and black and Native American people there. He called it a war against the savages and the Negroes, and took Florida, made Florida safe for plantation slavery, and removed the last escape point. From the time Andrew Jackson took Florida, the entire South was locked down solid.
Also, a Haitian slave revolution, which was successful, terrified people so much because these were African Americans who really did know how to fight. They knew how to plan a battle. They knew, besides knowing how to use arms and armaments, they knew strategy, they knew all of that. And they were helping in South America also, the Bolivarian revolutions. So the slave owners here were utterly terrified that they were going to come here and bring what they knew, because it's always outside agitators, right?
Sure.
I mean, nobody ever thinks of doing this by themselves.
Right.
It's always
Right.
got to be somebody came in from the outside.
Right.
And this would be like the greatest fantasy outside agitator possible. They would come and instruct our slaves into rebellion.
The so-called French Negroes,
Yeah.
who were presumed to carry the virus of revolution. There's a book by Michel Rolfe-Trio called Silencing the Past, in which he talks about the phenomenon of the Haitian Revolution being left out of the narrative of world history for a very long time.
Right.
And he says that ultimately the reason that it was left out was because it was unthinkable. It was unthinkable at the time that black people could organize themselves militarily, organize a successful rebellion, fight a long war, and win.
We've talked quite a bit. We talked a little bit about George Washington, talked more about Thomas Jefferson. You just mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation. Talk a little bit about Lincoln's role in slavery, and sort of what you understand from your research were Lincoln's motivations. He was a racist.
I think probably everyone was at that point.
Who was not a full-fledged abolitionist.
Yes. And he was surrounded by full-fledged abolitionists who hammered in his ear every day. Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens,
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass. And Lincoln was a man who was capable of self-reflection and also of self-correction, I believe. He did not own slaves himself, did not want to. His primary goal, as he said over and over again, was to preserve the Union. And he realized at a certain point that the best way to preserve the Union, when it came to that point, he was ready to go all the way, and he declared abolition, and more to the point, allowed African Americans to enlist in the Union Army and carry arms and fight and shoot and do all of those things. And that makes a huge difference, just as women want to be in the military to prove that they are equal also, you know, in a later fight that came along. And it did more to educate, I think, a lot of white Union people about the humanity. I mean, I hate saying this, but people have been trained for so long to not even look at at human beings as human beings first. And this proved, as it seems to, in military terms, these are people who can fight as well, if not better, than anyone, and whose bravery is incredible.
I think Lincoln also.
And he always,
Yeah.
Lincoln always went out of his way to admire in public and in person the people who fought and fought bravely.
Yeah, and Richard Campanella in New Orleans has an excellent book about Abraham Lincoln's visit to New Orleans, you know, when Lincoln came down on a raft. And I think there's no question that Lincoln detested slavery. And having seen it in New Orleans firsthand, I think told him what he needed to know.
So let me ask you, I said, you know, in order to try to get to some point of light about this subject, we had to go through this tunnel of darkness. The exhaustive, extensive research that you all did, for someone like a Frederick Douglass, born a slave, to become the figure that he came, can you speak to Frederick Douglass from, again, that research?
He had to have been one of the most intelligent people who has ever lived. I mean, just innately, he had a brain that he mostly became self-taught in terms of his education. In particular, at the beginning, all it took was for him to start to learn his letters. Somebody gave him, I can't remember, it was the woman that he was living with in Baltimore, gave him the start in learning the alphabet. And all of that was taken away from him at a certain point. But wherever he could, he got a hold of some kind of reading material, and he continued to teach himself to read, and whatever he could find, he would read.
And he taught others.
But he also remembered what he read. So, like, if he only had a chance to look at a newspaper for a minute, he could remember what he read, and he could pass on the information to others, among the other things that he did. He was a truly remarkable human being. It has nothing to, I mean, whatever race he might have been, who was like being brought up in these conditions in which he has no privilege, nothing, and raises themselves in this way, they are remarkable what they overcome and what they can achieve.
I've been reading David Blythe's biography, which makes it clear what a brilliant orator he was. And you could, if you read his speeches, they're still, I mean, they're part of the hardcore of the backbone of American literature, along with, I would argue, the slave narratives, which Frederick Douglass's 3 autobiographies also form part of. I think we have to go over and over again to the primary documents, and the primary documents, those oral histories, those slave narratives, they corroborate each other. There may be suspect things in them, like maybe this isn't true, maybe this was the white editor saying this, da-da-da-da. But they overwhelmingly corroborate each other. You go back and you read those documents over and over, and it's, I think, the best way to enter into that time.
Also, Frederick Douglass's influence went past the United States and the Northerners and so on. There are scholars who have been doing work lately with Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and they have found whole passages where Jane Eyre is speaking of herself in the same kind of rhetoric and the same terms, the same language that Frederick Douglass used in his ministry in England.
Frederick Douglass, who was a member of the Board of Trustees of this prestigious university in which we sit right now, Howard University. Folks, that wraps us for this evening. For more information on this program or any other program produced by WHUT, go to WHUT.org. Thanks for tuning in. Goodbye, and may God bless you.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.